I think I'm just going to give it another minute before we start. So just hang in there. Okay, let's get started. So welcome, thank you for coming. Just please note that closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. Thank you for watching the show. I think it's really exciting to see all of you here because as I'm sure the cast and crew can attest to, I think we've missed the live audience part of theater. So it's really nice actually being able to engage with an audience. So with that, we can just get started with introductions. After the introductions, you guys will have the opportunity to ask all of the questions you have. So hold on to that, whatever questions you have, and you're going to be able to use the Q&A function or ask your question yourself out loud. So yeah, so Lauren, will you get us started with your name, your pronouns if you're willing, your where you are right now, and your role in the show, and your favorite part of the show or the process?
Yeah, hi, I'm Lauren Stock. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently located in Dallas, Texas, and I'm the director and thesis writer for this production. And thank you all for being here. It's really, like Malika was saying, it's really fun to have some sort of live engagement with people, since that was such a weird part of our experience on campus. But definitely my favorite, I have a whole list of like my favorite parts, but I think my favorite part in watching it tonight, I think was the astronaut scene. I think that's the first time that we really see all of the pieces come together with the projections and the set and the lights and the sound all going at the same time with the actors and all of it being very interdependent. And I really loved that today. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to Fox.
Hello, I'm Fox. I already forgot the information I'm supposed to share, so I'm just going to guess. My name is Fox. I am currently in my childhood bedroom in Weston, Massachusetts. Not Western, Massachusetts. Most people hear Western. When I say that, I mean Weston, W-E-S-T-O-N. Not that it's important. I use he, him pronouns. I was Christopher in the show. And then my favorite part of the show / process was probably Tech Week, which is a bit controversial. I always feel this after the fact. During Tech Week, I hate it, but afterwards I'm like, damn, that was a really cool process. Creatively, I just think it's wonderful. And it was wonderful to see the show come to life within the span of only a few days. So that was the favorite part of the show for me. And I will pass it off to Abigail.
Hi, I'm Abigail. I use she, her pronouns, and I was Judy, Christopher's mom in the show. I'm currently in Stinson, California. And one of my favorite parts about the process was definitely doing Just Dance warm-ups around the election when we were all very stressed and tense. That was a great way to release all those emotions. And I'll send it down to Vincent.
Hey, hi everyone, my name is Vincent, he, him pronouns. Current location, I'm in my bedroom here in the great state of New Jersey. My role in the show, I played Reverend Peters, among other ensemble roles. Also that cop that got stuck on the train with Christopher, who was wondering when Julie was getting born. That was one of my favorite lines. But my favorite part of the show, I think, was the rehearsal process. I'm new to Wesleyan, I'm a freshman, and just familiarizing myself with theater at Wesleyan with my castmates and doing improv, and or like Abigail saying, like, just dance, like just those little things of getting comfortable in the space. That was one of my favorite parts. And I'm gonna pass it to Chapin.
Hi, everybody. My name's Chapin. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is where I'm from. And I played Siobhan in this production of Curious Incident. And my favorite part of this process, obviously, I loved every moment of it. Working with the cast and crew was really incredible. But I had the opportunity to speak pretty early on with a friend of Lauren's, who's also a special ed teacher. Her name is Elena. And we just had a Zoom session, and she just kind of told me about her experience. And it was really eye-opening, and especially her experience as a virtual special ed teacher on Zoom in the middle of a pandemic is like a whole nother level. And so it was really great to talk to her, and she gave me a lot of amazing pointers and tips in terms of the role, but also just hearing about her life was really great. So yeah, and I'm gonna pass it to Abby.
Hi, I'm Abby. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also in my room in Bethesda, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C. I played Mrs. Alexander, among other roles. And my favorite part of the process was like becoming an old lady and figuring out what that like felt like. I don't usually play old characters, so like figuring out how an older person's body moves and works was just really fun to like explore. Yeah. And I will pass it to Sam.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sam. I use he, him pronouns. I'm in Westchester, New York. I played Roger and ensemble characters, and I was also the assistant lighting designer for the show. I think my favorite part of the process was something not included in the video. And sorry, Abigail, for this one, but it was when Abigail fell over during our dress rehearsal, because it was the hardest I have laughed in about a year and a half. So I will pass it on to Charlie.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I am using he, him pronouns. I'm up in Burlington, Connecticut. I was the set designer for the show. And I think my highlight for the show was definitely the scenic load-in process, and finally being able to build these things out and watching the cast start to use the panels and the blocks and everything, and just seeing the vision that we designed come to life. And I'll pass it to Joanna.
Hi, I'm Joanna. I use she, her pronouns. I was the dramaturg on this production, so I basically just did some a lot of external research about some of the themes in Curious Incident. And my favorite part of the process was probably Lauren brought in this really cool autistic theater maker named Ben Renan, and he talked a lot about his work with disability advocacy in the context of theater, and we actually got to see a production he worked on that was really, really cool. And I will pass it on to Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate, she, her pronouns, and I was the projections designer for the show. And I think my favorite part was also Tech Week, because despite all the stress and craziness that it brought, it also was the time that we were all together sort of working and watching the show come to life, which was amazing. And I'll pass it on to Annie.
Hi, I'm Annie. I use she, her pronouns. I was the stage manager, and I am in my room in Maine. And I would say that my favorite part of the show was also Tech Week, but more just because I got to interact with all of the other creators on this show and learn a little bit about what they were doing, watching Charlie and Ion and Kate and Gabriel and everyone kind of do their thing, and was just fascinating, and I loved it. I don't know who hasn't gone yet.
I think Nina.
Nina.
Hi, I am Nina. My pronouns are she, her. Where I am currently is Boulder, Colorado. My role is Mrs. Shears and Miss Gascoigne and ensemble. And my favorite part of the show was, I don't know, just being able to hang out with everyone and meet some really cool people.
Great. Is that everyone else? Okay, awesome. Hi, I'm Malika. I use she, her pronouns. I'm in Virginia right now. My role in the show was of the community outreach coordinator, which meant that I wasn't super involved with the production itself. So I had the privilege of watching the show live. And I think that was one of my favorite parts of this whole process, actually getting to see live theater. That was incredible. And my other favorite moment was the accessibility in theater panel that we did about 2 weeks ago, where we got a chance to talk to some theater makers who had disabilities and were disability advocates. And they were all incredibly like talented and artists, and also like really, really insightful people. So that was my highlight, I think. So there's so much more to introduce with everyone. And if you want to learn more about anyone, or you want to read their image descriptions, you can find that.
Malika, you just muted yourself.
Thank you for letting me know. Okay, great. So if you want to learn more about our cast and crew, I just sent some more information about them in the chat. So go ahead and take a look. And now I think we're pretty much ready for our questions to begin. So there are two ways that you can ask a question. You can ask through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also ask by raising your hand. And so if you raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can just ask your question out loud. You can also use the chat to just engage in any way that you want, but if you ask a question through there, I might miss it. So I'd encourage you to use the Q&A and the raise hand function. With that, we can start asking the questions. So someone asked, what was the hardest part of creating the show during a pandemic? Lauren, do you want to get started?
Yeah, I can start, and then anyone else is welcome to jump in. I think that there are two parts of this question. One of them definitely being the fact that like we never knew when things were going to get changed, and we never knew how far we were going to get before we hit something that was going to be different than what we thought it was going to be. And so that kind of like uncertainty, I think, was a lot of what was really hard about it. But I honestly think the hardest part about it for me, especially being a senior and this being my thesis, was like not being able to spend all of the outside time with people. Like we were so lucky to have an in-person rehearsal process and whatnot, but like not being able to hug each other at the end of performances and like get meals together and things like that normally I feel like are such a part of a show culture. I think that was the really like what felt like it was missing from this, that I think we did such an amazing job of keeping in this process, and especially during tech, of really spending so much time together. But I think for me, I really just missed giving people hugs and like spending all of that extra time together.
Annie, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, I second that. I think like the congratulations after the show would sometimes feel a little bit weird. But also from like a stage managing perspective, just logistically, sometimes there are jobs that are like done much better when people aren't 6 feet apart. And so trying to maneuver that and come up with different ways to like problem solve during tech week was sometimes tricky. And also just like ensuring that there was never too many people in the space. Like I think Lauren was always of the mindset that like the more the merrier. But unfortunately, like this semester, we just had to like limit who was involved and who was in the space, which was sometimes unfortunate and not always what we wanted, especially when it came to performance time and we had to have a limited audience.
Thank you. Yeah. Are there any actors who have anything that they want to share? Yeah, Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, I think actually we just had another question that came in about the kind of idea of not touching, and how the show had this whole, it lends itself kind of to not touching people because of Christopher being touch averse. But as an actor, I found it very difficult to have to play against my instincts to get closer to people, because often that is a way that you deal with a lot of stress and a lot of trauma. And so like I can only imagine for Drew that when he was doing the scene where he has to tell Christopher that his mother has died, the instinct there is to go in and to touch, because it's kind of the way that humans interact. I know for me in a lot of scenes, I had to make sure I was holding myself back from a lot of my instincts. And so I think that was something really difficult for me as an actor, because we're taught to be so open and so vulnerable. And a lot of that comes in the form of human contact. And when you take that element out, it's just a really interesting and difficult thing to play with.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sam. And I think that's the perfect transition to that next question about the show lends itself really well to not touching. Was that easy to do in making the work together? Did that seem normal given our pandemic habits? What did you discover about your desires and instincts regarding touch? That's an excellent question. And I'm sure Lauren wants to start answering that first, considering touch is such a big part of her thesis.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Sam was saying is a big part of that I think in some ways it really supported the show, in the sense that, like, in that scene with Drew telling Fox that his mother had died, that the characters Ed and Christopher, that he couldn't touch him. And I think in a lot of ways that really served the show, because that's something that many of us would have wanted to do and wouldn't have been the right thing for Christopher to do in that moment. So I think in a lot of ways it was really good for us. The other thing that really stuck out to me is how much our perspective on touch changed throughout the show. And I remember our very first couple of rehearsals, it looked so weird that we were blocking people 6 feet away and that we were moving with all of this space, and it felt so uncomfortable. And I remember being really worried at the beginning of the process, like, how are we going to make this look like something worth seeing? But I think over the course of several months of working on it and of us just living in this pandemic more, our minds just adjusted to seeing each other 6 feet away and to being separated. And it got so much easier to accept the fact that, like, we would come into rehearsal and we would all just be spaced out, and we would come into tech and we would space out. And when the show was over, the hardest thing in the world not to hug everyone. And that was something that at that point in the semester, we just knew was something we had to do.
Yeah, Nina, go ahead.
I just wanted to add and say that I think in terms of blocking and stuff, I found it personally like really powerful. The distance that was, of course, forced at the time, but also made a really powerful statement. Like, for example, like the moments that you see in the show where like people put their hands up together. I think that's really powerful in the fact that like there is no touching, but it is this moment of connection. And I think that being in this like pandemic experience has kind of forced us theater makers to think very much outside of the box of like how people can connect with each other in ways that aren't like touch oriented. And I think Lauren did an amazing job thinking of all of the different ways that we can do that. And it was really cool to see what we came up with.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add to answer that question? Yeah, Vincent, go ahead.
Also, I think sort of giving off Nina's point, I realized as I watched the production today, sort of these important moments, especially where Christopher and his father kind of have the hand motion thing. And to me, they were even much more powerful when they had to be distant. And in those moments where, Christopher, for example, like wasn't really reciprocating it when Ed wanted to, touch him. I don't know, I just had so much of an elevated sort of sense of meaning that, they had to be separate literally on the stage, but also that kind of, parallels what was going on like in, the scope of the show. So I don't know, I think in particular, Lauren, was kind of had this idea, obviously, as it's pretty integral to her thesis of like, space and touching and, what distance can mean both like, as actors, trying to keep our distance, but in the same time, like within the play. And I just think this is my first time seeing it, obviously, but it really unearthed a lot of new meanings to sort of the role that, the distance could play, not just in the narrative, but, in the way that we interpret it too.
I also have to say, as an audience member, both watching the show live and just now watching it on a screen, it takes me like a couple minutes to realize that everyone's socially distanced, because by this point, like this is just the distance that I'm used to seeing. I don't know if anyone else who watched this online had a similar experience to me, but like I always have to do a double take, like, oh wait, they are 6 feet away. They're not anywhere near each other. And yeah, it's kind of nice to see that even now, it's possible to make theater that feels safe. Um, yeah, yeah. I think that can bring us to another question. What made you interested in doing this show? And we can bring that to Lauren.
Yeah, so I think my answer to this is very different than everyone else's because I started working on this show a very long time ago and came up with the interest in doing this show actually in high school. And over the summer when I was living in my high school room, I found these notes that I had made of like who in my high school friend group I would have cast in which roles. And the thing that I've always loved about this show is about the way that people move in public spaces, which is how this fits with my thesis that is joint with the sociology department looking at public spaces and the way that people move in those spaces. And I've always loved trains and being in spaces with trains and with the kind of transition of space. And this is really the only piece of theater I've ever seen that has that kind of crowd and that's not like a musical ensemble. And so that always really drew me to this. And then when I started sitting down to figure out my thesis proposal, I just kind of said, like, this is something that has a lot of meat to it. And the questions that I want to be asking are in this. And I think then when the question of physical touch in public spaces got totally thrown under the global microscope, it felt even more important to be looking at that. And then the questions of accessibility started coming into that conversation. And I think more and more throughout the semester, it just seemed like it was asking the questions that we needed to be figuring out the answers to, even if we didn't have them.
Thank you. Let's bring it to one of our designers, maybe. Does anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I remember Lauren emailed me, I think last summer, asking me to projection design for Curious Incident. And I had never projection designed before, but I loved the show. And so I was like, you know what, why not? Seems like a hell of a time. And so we ended up like FaceTiming and going over it. And we were like, all right, like, let's make this happen. And then we started working on it and, brainstorming everything, and it was just an amazing process, and it's just really cool to think about how far it's come since the summer.
Anyone else can jump in.
Actors, all of y'all were asked about this in your audition, so you can all talk about this too.
Yes, Charlie, go ahead.
Sure. Kind of going along with Kate, I think even from the beginning, when I first talked to Lauren in the spring, it was very much about designing space rather than designing a set for just the actors to be on. And especially as we started thinking about how that was going to look with social distancing and the pandemic and everything, it really became about designing changing spaces, not only to correspond to Chris's mindset, but corresponding to the places that he's in. So you get places like the really wide open space that feels really freeing, as well as those really tight spaces like Judy and Roger's apartment that just feels like really restrictive. And so I think shaping those spaces around the concept was really, really interesting for me.
I can also jump in. I joined this project in July, and I joined it at a time when a lot of other theater that was going to be on campus was getting canceled, just because it's just not an easy semester in which you can produce theater. So at that time, I felt like I was losing what would have been like my first opportunities actually getting involved in theater. And then I like got an email from someone that was from Lauren, and it was just inviting theater makers to do theater. And I'm sure like Lauren and Annie could talk more about this because they were involved in so many conversations around that time with anyone who was involved or interested in being involved with this project in any way. But I think such a big part of this project has been like keeping that open space for someone who wants to be interested to find their way into it. And that's kind of how I came into it, with like no clear idea of what role I wanted to do, but like I knew that I wanted to be a part of this project. And like I like felt really connected to the things that Lauren was talking about describing the show. And so I like found my way in with Lauren and Annie's help. So I think that that's kind of what made me interested in being a part of the show. Just that ability to be involved in the way that worked for me. Yeah. Does anyone else have anything they want to say?
Yeah, just to add to that, and why I put the actors on the spot, is there are so many people who wanted to make theater on campus this semester. And like Annie said, we always tried to take the more the merrier approach. And in a global pandemic, you can't have everyone. And so a big part for us when we were talking to everyone was bringing people on our team who really had specific interest in this project, and people who had specific care in the material and what we were trying to do. And so that's why I was kind of saying that all the actors were asked about this, because that was something in auditions that we were looking for, people who really cared about what we were doing. And I think that's one of the things that made this project so special, was that everyone on this team really had a buy into it. That wasn't just like, oh, I want to do a show because it's fun.
Yeah. So any actors still, the floor's still open for anyone who wants to say more. But you guys have also probably said a lot over the course of this project. So if we can move on to another question. I'm gonna put two questions together. I'm just gonna read them both out loud. Did you have an opportunity to speak with people on the autism spectrum? And I'm gonna put that with another question, which is, I know that you worked with some really cool experts in this process, and that there was a panel a couple of weeks ago with themes of accessibility. What are the questions that have come up from the conversations with those folks that you feel pulled through into the production? I think those two questions sort of go together, so we can answer them together. So to the first question about, did we have the opportunity to speak with people on the autism spectrum? The answer is yes. And the people that we spoke to were theater makers, professional theater makers from other universities, or people that we that like we found through our connections. And I will just pass it off to someone to say a little bit more on that. Lauren, do you want to go?
I would actually love somebody else to take this. I'm happy to talk, and I would love somebody else to take this. Maybe Joanna, not to throw you on the spot, but.
Yeah, I was actually gonna. Yeah, so we talked to a lot of people throughout the process. One of the main people we talked to on a couple of occasions was this guy named Ben. I don't actually know how Lauren got in touch with him initially, but yeah, Lauren, if you want to jump in on that.
He's friends with my uncle.
Oh, didn't know that. Yeah, so he is an autistic theater maker who had one of, I think, the key things he talked about with us that I think was a big takeaway is that he was really trying to steer us away from high functioning and low functioning terminology, because a lot of people point out that high functioning and low functioning are kind of pointless terms that still define functioning by like your traditional able-bodied neurotypical person. And he instead gave us the language of high impact and low impact, which is how much it impacts a person's day-to-day life. And Ben had a really interesting perspective on this, because he actually wasn't like technically diagnosed with autism until his, I think, early 20s, but his brother had very high impact autism, and he was raised alongside a brother who they knew was autistic all along. So he came in with like a lot of knowledge on that. And one of the things he was really talking about a lot to us is kind of the fact that, and this was also brought up at the accessibility panel last week, that disability and kind of the norms around anything in our society are just structured by what we deem as accessible and what we deem like should be the norm. So something isn't inaccessible to most people unless we make it that way. And like, you know, an example Lauren brings up a lot is like the idea of a ramp. Like, we wouldn't view accessibility the same way if everything was built with ramps instead of with stairs. And another example Ben loves is like, the only reason that we view phones as so disruptive in the theater is because we've been taught that phones do not belong in the theater. And Ben was like, if you're in a coffee shop, there's a million phones ringing around you and you can focus on whatever you're listening to and whoever you're listening to. But the second you're in a theater, it just becomes like absolutely fully unacceptable. So I think we learned a lot throughout this process to kind of restructure the things we think are wrong or incorrect or abnormal. And we were more thinking about challenging why we view those things as unusual and how we can kind of restructure that and therefore give more people a voice and more people just like an accessible experience. People want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think that was a great summary of everything that we heard from Ben. As for the accessibility in theater panel, that actually ended up happening after the production was performed and shot. So it's hard to say that it informed the process of making that production itself, although we did get a chance to speak with some of the experts on that panel well before the panel. So I think that might have informed it a little bit more. I would struggle to say exactly how it informed the production because I was not super involved with that. So I would love for someone else to take that. Kate.
I can speak to that a little bit and also speak a little bit for Gabriel Ballard, who was our lighting designer but isn't here tonight. I think that both of us, in thinking about the train station scene and a lot of the other sort of flashy, sort of more intense scenes for Christopher, a lot of the normal approach for theater and for this show is to scale everything up and make it overwhelming for the audience to sort of represent how Christopher is feeling. But if we were to do that, then we would be creating an inaccessible theater space. And so our goal was instead to take away things earlier and then add things in a way that made it different from the rest of the show, but not so much so that it felt like it was overwhelming to our audience, who may be impacted by those things. And I think, you know, that's really apparent the more you pay attention to the show, is how it doesn't have the flashing lights or some of those things that you might expect from a train station or similar overwhelming scenes, because that clearly wouldn't be an accessible experience.
I think kind of jumping off the back of that, talking about the design aspect, is that a lot of time there's this idea that as long as you put a warning on something, it's good enough. You can do whatever you want as long as you tell people that they're not welcome if they have a hard time. I think that kind of working against that and saying, rather than just putting warnings on things that aren't accessible, just making things accessible is generally a better practice. And so that's something that, at least for me, I had done some other lighting in the past and I had not always thought about it. And it's something that's going to stick with me after this process.
Yeah, I think going off of that, one of the conversations, especially that Sam and Gabriel and I had, Gabriel, who Kate mentioned, our lighting designer, who is going to be on tomorrow night, if you want to talk to him. One of the conversations that we had really early on was about strobe lights, and about the way that strobe lights kind of control your eyes. Like, you miss things in the middle. And so strobe lights would make a lot of sense for something like those scenes of physical touch where there isn't actually touch, that we were trying to cover up something. But were we to add strobe lights into the show, it would be so inaccessible for a lot of people. And so like that was a conversation we had very early on in thinking about what are just other ways that we can make things work and that we can make things look the way we want them to and feel those same tones like Kate was talking about in those overwhelming scenes, that doesn't actually create that problematic response for people.
Right. I'm just going to read out another question because it's all along the same lines. How do you think this project and creating work with people with autism and disabilities in mind will inform your future projects and work? And I can speak to that a little bit because it's basically what Sam and Lauren were just talking about. It's kind of a question of when in a theatrical process do you talk about accessibility? And I think this project has taught me that the answer is from the start, because, you know, you can go back at the end and try to figure out how to make it accessible, but then that's when that becomes not such an easy thing to do. And then people think that accessibility is something that maybe isn't worth doing, which is not true. Um, and yet, if you do it from the start, it it all comes together. I think that's a really big thing, and accessibility is like a process, which is why it should be happening from the start. And yeah, I don't know. I was telling Lauren just the other day that this is kind of one of the first big theatrical projects I've worked on, and it's been one that's really centered around the topic of accessibility. And for that reason, we've been trying to make things accessible with a lot of intention. And that means from this point on, when I am involved with a theatrical project, this is the standard that I'm going to be thinking of. Like, this is the accessibility that we need to be striving for. Um, yeah, so that's my answer. Anyone else has anything to say? Vincent, go ahead.
Also, I think a lot of the times when we talk about accessibility, like what draws people to the theater, I think is, I mean, this almost sounds like a cliche, but people always say theater is a mirror of society and whatnot. And I think what draws a lot of people to be able to be there is like to see themselves, you know, through characters and to, you know, see themselves on stage. And I think an important point that we discussed in the creative process, especially when we were talking to other people, was you know, sometimes there's this moment in a play, it may, or even in a film or a TV show with a character who's maybe has a disability or is of a marginalized background, where, you know, it's almost the takeaway is, I may be in a wheelchair, but I'm just like you. We're all the same. And it's like, that is so like not it, you know? And like, I think a really good thing that I think Lauren was keeping in mind, and also that we were very conscious of in this production, was like, you know, characters obviously, like when they do have disabilities or they are from marginalized backgrounds or something like that, like obviously that is a huge part of their identity, like absolutely. And that's something that we should obviously be taking into account when we are performing it. But at the same time, there are so many more poignant, so many more insightful conclusions and insightful lessons that we can, you know, learn from pieces of theater. Like, I think Curious Incident, or Curious Incident maybe not, you know, the absolute best, you know, thing, like, you know, you shouldn't put it on a pedestal or anything, but I do think that there are a lot of ways that we can, you know, look at art like this and, you know, not go back into that cliche of like, we're all the same, we're just like you know, because I mean, that's not what the world's like. It's not that simple. And also we did take into account the Curious Incident, even though it is, you know, sort of, it is a play about somebody who does have autism, and the writer, you know, and the writers of not just the play but also the original novel did not have autism either. So we did speak about that, and how are we creating something that's accessible for people, you know, you didn't really consult when you were, you know, originally writing the novel and adapting it for, you know, Broadway with laser beams and huge, you know, kind of sounds and this like assault on the senses of sorts with that comes with, like, you know, a large scale Broadway show. So I'm kind of going down in a rant right now, but I think those are just sort of the things that, you know, I think it's important to consider for future pieces of work that you know, anyone else in the audience, us, wants to put on in a theater. Those are very important things, I think, to take into consideration.
Yeah, thank you for that, Vincent. Lauren.
Yeah, I think going back to the beginning of what Vincent was saying, I had a really interesting conversation with one of my best friends at school who actually got to see the show in person. And when we were talking about it the next day, she said how she didn't remember when she had seen it like on Broadway or something. She didn't remember the ending being so heavy. And that moment with Christopher asking, "Can I do anything?" She didn't remember that being so like hard to sit through. And that was something that was very intentional for us, because I think the Broadway and the touring company left that as this very upbeat of like, I can do anything because I went on a train and I overcame my disability, which is what so much disability theater deals with. And it was a really conscious decision for us to give that scene a lot of weight, for Siobhan not to reply, for Christopher really to be asking that question that's not getting answered, because it's not that easy. It's not that he went to London and now he can do anything and he no longer is autistic. Like, he did something and that was amazing and he was brave. And there are still going to be things in his life that are challenging for him. And I think that was a really important moment for us to deal with. Like Vincent was saying, of recognizing that things are different and he doesn't have to be just like everybody else to be a part of this world.
Joanna.
Yeah, just one last thing that's like a little bit tangential, but I know it's kind of not just about my future art, but about kind of everything in my life. It felt like every class I was in this semester, I suddenly started talking about how it tied into like this show and the things I was learning. And one of the things that I kept coming back to was like, what makes a certain trait or identity disabling? And it's so much like the way we frame it right now is always like, oh, how can we make this person act more quote unquote normal? And so much more of that should be, how can we reestablish like what is acceptable, and how can we not make people act more like what we think they should, and instead take the way that these people naturally are and make that more acceptable and make that like not disable them within the society. And I had another thing that I kept coming back to that is a bit of a tangent, but I think worth mentioning, is that a lot of people make the point that it's not societally acceptable to make fun of people with autism, but a lot of things that are frequently mocked and joked about are traits that are like very often associated with autistic people, like having specific interests, like having specific like aversions to certain things. And I think we need to think a lot harder about like certain biases we have and certain things that are deemed as acceptable to laugh about, and think about where that humor is actually rooted and like not to do it. That's my take.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear, just asking some questions, that this is something that Joanna and Lauren and the whole cast and crew have been thinking about this whole semester. So thank you for that, Joanna. I have a question for Abigail. Abigail, this is from your cousins. Your accents were great. Did you have a dialogue coach?
No, no, we did not. Hi, cousins, love you. Yeah, we watched some YouTube videos on our own and just went with it, learned from each other.
Thank you, Abigail. Oh, Vincent, do you have something to say for Abigail?
I just want to say briefly, like for me, I don't know if like what accent constitutes an amazing one, but I did watch Fleabag, and that was very informative for me.
It is a very informative show. That's a great show. Okay, a couple questions for the actors. How does it feel to watch your own performances alongside the audience? How does this differ from your past experiences of performing for a live audience? And along the same lines, how was it different as stage actors to know that this is being filmed? And did you do anything differently with staging your performances than you would have in a traditional performance on stage? Who wants to go first?
I can answer some of those questions. I mean, personally speaking, I hate watching video performances of myself. I think a lot of actors feel that way. I think us as actors, we're typically like very critical of our abilities, and it's hard to. I'm supposed to watch this whole show with my entire family tomorrow, and that's very nerve-wracking for me, because it feels like you're like, this is a huge project I worked on, and there's a lot of weight to it. I think in terms of like comparing that to my past experiences performing, obviously like sometimes there will be a recording of the performance, but it's always the performance itself, which is the actual like experience. And I think in this show, it was a little more evenly distributed between like the performance aspect versus the showing aspect, which we're really just getting into now. But it's a cool experience also to see it from the outside, despite the fact that it might be a little cringy to see, or at least for me to see myself, because I have such a newfound appreciation of the technical elements of the show, that it's really hard when you're like performing to like fully notice what's going on around you. But seeing it from afar, it's so incredible and amazing, all of the technical elements of the projections that was able to be achieved.
Chapin and then Abby.
Yeah, so this is actually the second like semi-virtual performance that I've done with Wesleyan. The first was last spring and it was all on Zoom, and I did it in my attic with my whole family watching downstairs. And so for me, it was like such an immense privilege. And I think for a lot of other people have said this too, but just to be able to do live theater in a real theater, like with real people, was just so incredibly exciting to me in terms of like I think we didn't even know that like one of the cameras were there one night. Like we were very unaware of like where the cameras were. And I think that was very intentional on Lauren's part to just be like be in the moment, be in the space, which I was really grateful for. But I also think kind of this whole pandemic moment has given kind of this unprecedented access to theater in a lot of different ways. And I think a lot of people are kind of grieving the loss of being in a space in person and seeing a live show, but at the same time, these kinds of new ways of having access to theater and being able to watch it in your own home, because there are people who aren't able to sit through a 2-hour show or aren't able to get into a theater at all. And also like being able to have closed captioning on this was really amazing too, and all the different ways we were able to make it more accessible and able for people to see it from the comfort of their own home, I think was really great, and it was really cool to be a part of. So yeah.
Yeah, I also dislike watching myself very strongly, and I actually haven't seen it yet. I was busy tonight and I couldn't see it. And so it was extremely bizarre. I've never not been present at opening night for a show I've been in. Very bizarre having all my friends texting me saying like we're watching, and me just being like, that's great. I'm not there. It felt very strange and like removed. I'm very excited to see it. I don't with my whole family, which will also be really fun and stressful. And I just, it's so, it's this really bizarre feeling of like, again, I've never witnessed my own performance with the audience, and like that sort of like blurring of the lines between like being part of the audience and being part of the like production has been something that's really bizarre to like think about and experience. And like in terms of creating the production, it still felt like live theater, especially because we weren't focused on the cameras and we didn't stage it in any way that was like for camera. But I have very I don't know, I chose a very interesting like life path for someone who has I have very severe performance anxiety, and that's literally the name of it. And so choosing to do performance and theater was a really interesting choice on my part. And not having a physical audience there actually really decreased that for me. And I still managed to have the same amount of adrenaline with slightly less anxiety, which was really interesting and actually a really like soothing thing that I was not super expecting. Which it was definitely a little bizarre because there was something about it that it's not that it felt fake, because it definitely felt like we were performing, but it felt different, like in a distinctly like new and like I don't it just it felt very special, I guess, to feel like we were really like doing something that like nobody's really had to do and figure out before. So it was bizarre and a little crazy, but also so like just eye-opening to the like new ways that theater can really be like experienced, I guess. So yeah.
Vincent, go ahead.
Yeah, and I want to say, for me, at least, I think even those of you back home, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I think Reverend Peters has some very funny moments. And so when I was rehearsing, I would get, like people in the cast would be like, ha ha ha, if like, for a visual cue, whatever. But when we were actually performing, like I didn't, I would do something and I was like, this usually gets laughs. Why is no one laughing? And it was like, oh no, like I'm screwing it up. No one's laughing. But I was like, obviously, we were on camera. So there are little things like that. And I've only like virtually done comedies and musical comedies before this. This is like my first like dramatic play, so it was kind of interesting to try and settle into that trusting myself, and I think I think I have the best judgment of how I'm doing, at least, and I become more confident in that respect. So that's a good thing. But also, one thing also, I'm not used to acting with cameras, obviously, on stage. So I was so scared I was gonna look into the camera for some reason, like randomly during the production. And I think I said this to somebody. I was like, I'm gonna look in the camera, like I feel it, like I'm just gonna look in the camera for a whole line and freeze. But thankfully, at least in the version you saw, that didn't happen. So that was good. But I think those are some of the things I personally struggled with when transitioning into this new type of streamed theater.
I have to say, Vincent, I laughed during your live performance and I laughed again on online. Like, you are not doing anything wrong. Sam.
Yeah, I guess just kind of jumping off the back of that, like purely from a technique perspective, as an actor, you can't give a performance that's perfect for a camera and a performance that's perfect for a stage at the same time. So I think we all had to make a decision. I think Lauren made the decision for us that we were going to perform it as if it was a stage show. And I think the design as well was heavily focused on as if it was a stage show and it was a recorded stage show rather than us acting for a camera. And I think that necessitates things being bigger and louder, and just in general you have to be a little less subtle because people are going to be farther away. And it wasn't like we were going to have cameras right here that we could give speeches into. We were still giving them out to the house and out to the audience. So from a purely technique perspective, at least for me, and I assume for most of the other actors, it was very much more like, or not even more like, it was a traditional stage performance rather than something like an on-camera work.
Thank you. And with that, I think we have one question left that we can answer live. So the staging, blocking, music, and set / projections came together so beautifully, like a dance. The train platform scene, especially, so vivid. Can you talk about how you layered in these elements during the rehearsal / tech process? Can we start with our designers? Charlie, go ahead.
Sure. I think the most important part of that was making sure that all of us designers really work closely together for the entire thing. And I'm sure Kate and Sam can speak a little more to this, but especially for really complex scenes where there's a lot going on and things are coming together. Like as we were designing scenes, me and Kate would compare notes every few weeks and make sure that we were always in sync about what it was going to look like, where things were going to be when, so that there was never this out of sync of like I had a plan and someone else had a different plan. It was always hand in hand, especially once we got into the space, so that everything worked out.
Kate?
Yeah, so the train station scene was a bit crazy. I think for a lot of reasons. Originally, we were planning on projecting on the panels and having them move around and move through the projections. And that didn't end up being possible just because of the technical limitations of the show. And so we had to end up being a little bit creative to still create the movement and the sort of craziness, hecticness of the station without doing too much with projections. And I think a dance is a really good way to describe it, actually, because it was really, it had to be kind of perfect in terms of the timing, because Annie knows, as our stage manager, calling that scene was pretty insane, because we had the projections come in on the side panels, and they had an in cue and they had an out cue, and the out cue had to be called just before the light cue because the light cue would close the projector. And there were like milliseconds maybe in between those two cues, and so it really was about sort of getting the rhythm down perfectly to create a smooth but also hectic feeling, a perfectly hectic feeling, I guess. But it was a lot of fun, and I think it came together wonderfully.
Nina, and then Fox, and then
I wanted to say that I think what really aided in that seamless performance that you guys see is that for me, at least in my personal experience, this show has had the longest amount of like rehearsal time that I have ever worked on. And I think that that was such a valuable time because I think our first like run through was probably a month before we actually like went on stage and performed. And so being able to like get down the blocking, and it really is kind of like a dance because you have to like understand, like I had to remember I'm on train 1, 4, 6, whatever, and count that in my head, which is hard to do when you're multitasking. But to get all of that down, and to get like the relationship of how you move through a space with other actors around you, especially while keeping social distance, it was incredibly valuable to like have all of that extra time to practice that out. And then once you have like a really solid basis, adding in the technical elements like really made it a completely seamless process.
Something I found really interesting about the train scene was, for everybody else, it was this like controlled, chaotic, ordered scene. Like it required a lot of coordination on the part of the actors and a lot of coordination on the part of designers. And what's really interesting about playing Christopher is the idea of like everything that's happening is sort of happening in my own head. And so there were a lot of times where I would just get plugged into a scene without having like seen it beforehand. And we just like sort of had to run with it. And that idea of like, there's Christopher and then there's this world and they're running independently of each other is just very, very cool to me. So it was really interesting I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. It's been a long day in Weston, Massachusetts. I just thought the train scene is very beautiful, and it's surprising like how simple it was to plug myself in to scenes like that required a lot of coordination on the part of others. It was really cool.
Thank you, Fox. We can move on to Lauren. Do you want to?
Sure. Annie, if you wanted to answer that, I don't want to skip you because I always love to hear what you have to say, but I can wrap it up with that one if we want. I think the two pieces of that question about everything layering together, part of it is like that for me is the really fun part of being the director, is that I get to see all of these pieces as they're happening. And the designers are working together to make something together over here. And in our production meetings, we're talking about how every little element is working together. And the actors are doing the same kind of thing. And I'm the one that gets to be in the middle with Annie, trying to figure out like, how does that all actually happen together? And one of my favorite parts of the process was like, we would work on a scene in rehearsal and I would come home and all of a sudden I would have 8 emails from Ion with different sound files and 10 texts from Kate with different projection images. And I got to sit down and say, okay, we just did this scene. What would it look like if we layered this projection and this sound and whatnot? And I also had the privilege of living with Chapin this semester. And I would call her into my room and just say, hey, can you read this scene for me so I can listen to it with the music and watch the projection? And I think that's how so much of it came together, was just being able to say like, oh, look at all of these pieces coming together at the same time. And so even though they didn't meet each other until tech, like I got to kind of be on the back end of putting them all together. And the other piece of that question that I love is that mention of a dance. And Annie and I both have backgrounds in dance. And that was a huge thing when we first started talking about if she was going to work on this show, was being dancers and what this project looks like and the way that we both prioritize dance in movement and in theater. And so that I love that read to whoever this anonymous question asker was, because that was really important for me, that when we look at movement, we try to figure out how do we move through life like a dance. That sounds very cliche, but that's a big part of like the urban studies research that I'm doing for my thesis, is this conversation of like the sidewalk ballet and the motions that everyone goes through as they live their daily lives. And so I love that it did feel like a dance, because I think that was so much where the two of us were coming from.
Thank you. And with that, our questions are over. So thank you so much for coming to watch the show, for coming to the talk back, and hearing from all of us. And be sure to spread the word, because there's still 2 shows tomorrow, and people are still very, very welcome to come and watch and to come to our talkbacks afterward. yeah, so I think that's it for now. So have a good night, and maybe we'll see you tomorrow. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.